Trexler.
Helms.
That might have been the first time that we've successfully done that intro and something that feels Iron Culture-esque without us bumbling over our own shoelaces. So I'll count that as a win. I fully expect that our ratings and the number of shares we get on this episode will be drastically improved because of that. It's the little things that count, folks. So yeah, the first thing I want to address is I went back and I actually listened to the episode that was you and Omar where you talked about protein. And maybe I shouldn't have, because I was a little disappointed. Well, when I came back on and I talked about how we couldn't be driven apart, how we were on the same page, and you mentioned, hey, maybe don't go listen to that episode. I did what any person would do when they're told not to listen to something. I listened to it.
Right.
And I guess the framing of my biases towards protein, I felt they weren't fair. I feel like I've changed my mind over time. I feel like I've evolved as a human. And
are you? I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. This has caught me by surprise. Are you contesting the shadowy, nefarious nature of all your conflicts of interest, or is it just the other part?
Well, it is true, and Omar actually alluded to this, that I am an unpaid and also surprisingly unsolicited scientific board member for Elemental Formulations. It's almost like Ben Escrow feels like he knows what he's doing and he doesn't need to ask me about that. But I am not only an unpaid, unsolicited, and really non-contributing member of Elemental Formulations, but I also do... Well, I guess you said it wasn't shadowy. You said it was more just that I get stuck in my ways, and it was just this bias, this hobby horse that I had, that higher protein diets were just better, despite the evidence was. Or you tell me. I mean, I guess I've lost, as an old crotchety man, I've lost all touch with reality on how I'm perceived. Like, how out of touch am I? Are we talking like, I don't know how to use a cell phone level, or hey, I'm still on Facebook. Like what are we talking?
Well, I actually, I'm not even kidding. I was looking at the Jitterbug cell phone options the other day because I just wanted to spend less time using a smartphone. But ultimately, I felt like it was not really worth it to have a 2-phone system going. But so I kind of reject the whole premise of the contrast that you've set up there. And folks who are subscribed to the Mass Research Review know that Facebook group is where it's at. So I'm very, very into not using smartphones and using Jitterbugs instead. And I'm very into sticking with Facebook as the true original social media platform, because to this day, I'd still argue that it's the best place to actually have a decent conversation about whatever you're talking about. With Twitter, it's like, here, let me send you 13 different tweets because I have such extreme character limitations. And then, on Instagram, it's tough to follow a conversation in there. So yeah, Facebook, we need to bring it back. What do we need to do, Helms, to make Facebook the new trendy social media? And I don't even know about TikTok. So let me acknowledge that one as well. I'm not on it. Probably should be, but I'm not. So we need to figure out how we can bring it back and restore its greatness. To directly answer your question in an indirect way, I forget what I said about you and your stance on protein. I'm sure it felt like a fun joke at the time. I have no idea what I said. You're catching me on a Friday afternoon, on a very busy work week, so I haven't really been forming memories lately. I'm just kind of... It's like those very simple organisms that are just pure responses. There's a stimulus, I respond to it. So I'm sure, when I frame it that way, I'm starting to think maybe Omar kind of led me down a really dangerous road. So maybe you should take it up with him.
I really do think it is typically the person who is not there to defend themselves who should be getting the heat. And that has been the way that it's gone thus far on Iron Culture. And that's not because we're all, cowardly by nature and in a dysfunctional three-way. That's absolutely just the way things have happened in so much as Omar instigated this And then when I wasn't there, it might have seemed like it was me, but it was actually Omar. And that may change next time you guys listen next time. But ultimately, we're going to be sticking together, one big happy family that is always talking crap about the person who's not in the room. And we're such a big happy family that we don't have the schedule to all be on at the same time.
Yeah, I don't know. Now that you mention it, I'm kind of starting to resent Omar for making me say those things about you when you were gone. So but now there's some additional issues that we need to kind of resolve the next time the three of us get together.
Yeah, that's one option. Or perhaps next time the two of us are on, we can speak about the person who's not there. I find that's the best way to resolve conflicts.
Yeah, well, it avoids fights, at least in the short term.
Know what? And I'm all about short-term thinking, folks. So yeah. And then to indirectly ask the question that you indirectly asked that was indirect related to what we were directly talking about. How do we bring Facebook back? You're asking the wrong guy because I'm too old. If I talk about it, it'll automatically be a bad decision and an out-of-touch perspective. However, if you talk about ways to get people back on Facebook, it'll either be seen as retro, artisanal, or potentially hipster. And I mean that with the positive connotation. So you're going to have to lead the charge on that one.
Yeah, we need like some cool 19-year-olds who just really like to say, oh, actually, I'm only on Facebook now. And that'll really do it. And they'll say, I was on Facebook, I was there for their first album, before anybody heard of it. So, yeah, fingers crossed, because Facebook used to be great in the fitness world. Like you get really good discussions going. People would really engage in some dialogue. And by internet standards, it was a decent dialogue. By human standards, of course, it was terrible dialogue because it was the internet. But yeah, we'll bring it back. We just need some cool young people to do that. I think you and I have both aged out of the trend-setting phase of our lives.
Yeah, I am. I'm so aged out of trend setting that I don't actually know what trend setting means. So I agree. You know what? Like, that's fire. I'm woke, and let's put it on the Snap Talk.
Mm-hmm. All right. Speaking of talk, what are we talking about?
Yeah, what are we talking about? Honestly, I think a decent segue from how our opinions have changed over time. People might have seen the recent Mass Blast from the Past that I did on the Mass Research Review, where I actually discussed your very first publication, metabolic adaptation implications for the athlete. And the point I made in it was that the reason I respect you tremendously as a researcher, being totally serious now, is just how much your opinions evolve over time based upon the data, and how you're probably one of the more vocal proponents suggesting that the data on quote-unquote reverse dieting indicates that it, for example, may not be any better than any other post-diet strategy to reverse metabolic adaptation. And, in our recent discussions, actually here a couple episodes back on Iron Culture, you talked about, hey, what I framed under the umbrella of metabolic adaptation probably has about three or four different umbrellas. And I think in the same way, you have definitely positively influenced me on protein distribution, and also, protein intakes that are appropriate in a lot of your writings and thoughts. And it's always been something that I respect you a lot for, is that you typically don't have a dog in the race. Even a pet theory or bias, you're just very much empirically led and evidence led, which I think is a great trait. And one of the things that my mind has changed a lot on as I read about it is kind of my threshold and my willingness to bet on a neutral to positive if it's in the category of supplementation. So, and that is a pretty big shift. So I'm working on the third editions of the Muscle and Strength Pyramids, and my supplement chapter is probably going to change more than any other chapter. Other ones will have, modifications and different takes and, more options in some cases.
Let me guess, it's going to change the most because so many incredible new supplements have hit the market in the last 3 years.
Yeah, I mean, I've got at least 15 pages dedicated just to the reports that I've heard that just mind-blowing gains about turkesterone. And that's just the testimonial section on trigesterone. So that's just one of the subsections. No, unsurprisingly, it is not expanding. It's going to be a very short chapter. There'll be an appendix that immediately follows the supplement chapter that is far longer than the supplement chapter, just to give people an idea of what's happening there. And yeah, this is one of those things where the typical logic that I use on when do I, tilt over and provide a recommendation, I've had to create almost basically a new way of gauging that. All that's not entirely new, just to kind of give people an insight into the Helms algorithm of recommendation. I consider my audience first. Like, does someone have, relatively extreme goals where they have the time, energy, interest, and the desire to invest in diminishing returns, poor ROIs, right? The kind of thing that's hot right now is volume, right? So if you're going to get 80, 90% of your gains doing 8 to 12 sets per week, and you only can work out 3 times a week for 30 minutes to an hour, it's not a good thing to try to chase down, how do I max out the amount of gains I can get theoretically from doing volume? And, let me start around 15 to 20 sets, and then go from there. I would definitely recommend being in that more 8 to 10 range, or 8 to 12 or something like that, because what you're getting in return really doesn't make a lot of sense based upon your availability and your time and all those things. So if I'm talking to someone who is willing to invest in, unfavorable ROIs because they're trying to maximize rather than trying to optimize in terms of efficiency, my old heuristic was, sweet, let's just tell you everything that's neutral or potentially positive without a risk of harm. And examples of this might be, hey, we got some data on 2-a-day training that suggests you might be able to preserve your performance a little more. We don't have really good longitudinal data that says 2-a-day training with the same volume will produce better hypertrophy. But theoretically, if you're maintaining a higher force output and you're distributing things and improving recovery, it might be beneficial. If you really want to move your precision up from RIR ratings to actually getting an RIR velocity relationship, hey, maybe you get the open barbell system. It's $400. It may or may not make a difference if you're half an RPE point more accurate because you've established that velocity relationship, if you've got the disposable money. And I think it'd be very logical for someone to say, well, yeah, I definitely can spend $60 per month on this supplement that has maybe not the strongest data behind it, but has a chance of being beneficial for me. So why not? And that was the position I took as well. And I had a relatively liberal threshold for when would I consider a supplement sufficiently quote unquote evidence-based to go, yeah, give it a shot. But as I've become more and more aware on the harm potential of supplements, and a harm that's not necessarily obvious, it's not necessarily reflected by what's on the label, it's not necessarily reflected by things that happen seemingly commonly or that we talk about or are aware of, but more of some of these not well advertised hidden risks and some things that people maybe are too dismissive of that are actually a larger problem lurking in the dark related to the supplement industry. So that's what I wanted to talk about today, is just to help people understand that it's not just the cost to your wallet, the disposable income that you're losing when you decide to invest in a supplement that has less than stellar evidence behind it. And it's not just, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. There's a chance this could go well. I have disposable income. Why not? There is actually a potential harm that you could be incurring that is even magnified if, like many of our audience are, you're a drug-tested athlete. So that's what I wanted to talk about. And I think perhaps to kick things off, I want to put it back to you, Trexler, because you did a really good job. I want to say maybe 2 years ago, I think this is the first time you introduced the concept of the way you define supplement tiers. I think you have a tier 1 through 5 system, which I really like because I think it's a very good schema and model of understanding where the supplements go. And kind of the entry point of any supplement is, I believe, tier 3, right, on your schema?
Yeah. So I think it was about a couple years ago, I kind of introduced that topic of supplement tiers within the Mass Research Review. And, it was really just a way of kind of organizing my thoughts about how to kind of categorize supplements, because I was getting so many questions from people of, comparing this supplement to that one, or is this supplement, one of the most common questions, is this supplement worth it? And I was like, it's really hard to answer that without just kicking it back to the person asking and say, well, what do you consider a worthwhile effect? And, you have to get into this kind of individualized cost-benefit ratio. So it was always hard for me to actually answer those questions in a way that wasn't kind of excessively convoluted and basically a non-answer. So I was like, okay, what if I could, put together some tiers that at least offer some kind of guidance in terms of like, where would I slot this particular supplement in? And I think the biggest thing about the kind of supplement tier system or approach is that it's not just where does a supplement fall, but where does this supplement fall for a very specific thing, right? So, that's kind of a key to it is if you're going to say, hey, this is like a tier 1 or a tier 2 kind of supplement, the question is tier 1 or tier 2 for what? So like, creatine for endurance exercise is very different from creatine for strength and power. Same thing, beta alanine for someone who runs the 800 meters or a repeated sprint type sport is going to be very different from beta alanine for a bodybuilder, right? So that's kind of the key there. So what I'm doing as I'm talking about the supplement tier system is kind of bringing up the original figure to make sure that I don't botch the definitions or the categorizations that I kind of put forward there. So I've got it up here now. So like you said, everything kind of starts at tier 3, which is just like in the middle. It's a 5-tier system. So tier 3 basically means there's insufficient evidence to conclusively determine its effectiveness, right? So if there's something and we just simply don't know if it works, we don't know if it's good or bad, it kind of immediately starts at tier 3 by default. It's like the null hypothesis, I guess, which is not the null hypothesis, but it's just the null kind of default place where something goes until we learn something about it. Now, if a supplement comes out and there's some positive evidence, it can move up, right? So tier 2 basically means there's evidence supporting its efficacy or effectiveness, but maybe there's not a ton of data. Maybe the effects tend to be kind of small. Maybe the effects aren't super reliable. And then another possibility is, the data are positive, but only for like very specialized applications, right? So like for beta alanine, for example, there is, pretty good, relatively conclusive evidence that beta alanine is good for like super, super glycolytic stuff, right? So you're going maximum all out effort for like a minute or two. Beta alanine is great for that, right? So you could say, yeah, that's definitely an effective supplement for this very specific kind of niche application relative to the entire possibility of physical performance, right? It's probably not great for someone who's doing a powerlifting program, for someone who's doing a weightlifting program, for someone who just is doing cardio for health purposes. So it's a very niche application, which is why I'd put it in tier 2. Another example would be citrulline malate. That's kind of a supplement I've spent a lot of time writing about and doing studies on. It was one of the key areas of my dissertation research. I consider that to be tier 2 because, first of all, the effects tend to be pretty small. And second of all, the effects so far seem to be kind of unreliable in a way that we can't easily explain. There seems to be a lot of inconsistency in the citrulline malate literature when you're looking at strength-related outcomes, where you've got this whole string of studies that show positive effects and this whole string of studies that doesn't show positive effects. Now, as more data come out, we'll be able to really fill in the kind of funnel plot, so to speak, in your mind and say, well, if the funnel plot fills in very symmetrically and it looks like we're just seeing these, strings of positive and negative findings because they're just kind of straddling that line. It could very well be that as we get more data, we say, oh no, that it's consistently an effect size of about this. It's just that, we're kind of, seeing some of those small studies that are either very positive or very negative, right? So for now, I'd consider citrulline kind of a tier 2 supplement because of those small effects and the kind of inconsistency. Another example that would be tier 2 is the other kind of half of my dissertation, which would be dietary nitrate, usually in the form of beetroot juice. For resistance training purposes, there's really not a ton of data. There are plenty of studies looking at more endurance-focused outcomes, more related to endurance sport. For resistance training, there's not nearly as much. But the stuff that has come out is actually so far tends to be a little bit more consistent than what we see with citrulline. And so I would say, it's one of those things where even though there's less data, it seems to be more reliable so far, or at least more consistent. So again, dietary nitrate, just because there's such a lack of resistance training focused data, I would kind of put that in tier 2. And then tier 1, that's where you move up, and there's nowhere to go up from there. It's a tier 1 supplement just means there is strong evidence supporting reliable and noteworthy effects. And the only one that really comes to mind for me with resistance training outcomes in mind would be creatine. Creatine monohydrate, tried and true, pretty sizable effects, pretty consistent. The one instance of inconsistency so far is if you are a non-responder, but that is a type of inconsistency that we have really elucidated, right? We know the reasoning for that. It's not like there's this unexplainable kind of discrepancy where, half of the studies are just coming up negative. So, I would put creatine there, and then, maybe you could make the argument that protein belongs in there, not as a supplement, but just as a thing you got to have, right? So if supplementation gets you to an adequate intake, then I would say it belongs there. But I think we've probably mentioned many, many times over our careers across many different places, supplements aren't inherently better than food when it comes to protein. And if you're using a supplement to get from 2.5 grams per kilogram to 2.8, it's not going to do anything for you, in the vast majority of situations. So we've talked about the positive side of this whole tier system, and now we should probably take a turn that'll probably be most of our conversation today, which is the not so good side, right? So something starts as a tier 3 supplement, which means we just don't really have enough evidence to determine if this thing works. Now, tier 4 is the way I kind of describe that is that there's sufficient evidence to conclude that this supplement does not have practically meaningful effects for a given application, right? And so, again, all of this stuff is relative to a very specific use case or a specific application. A supplement can be tier 2 for this outcome and tier 4 for that outcome. And I'm getting kind of close to, with beta-alanine, I'm getting kind of close to saying for your typical weightlifting application, especially if we're talking powerlifting or Olympic lifting, it's probably tier 4, I'm getting pretty close there. Whereas, it's tier 2 or maybe even tier 1 for certain like highly anaerobic outcomes. So tier 4 it's not that we don't know, it's not absence of evidence like you alluded to previously. It's like, no, we've got evidence and this just doesn't work, or the magnitude of effect is so small as to be practically useless, right? And then tier 5 is the worst of the worst, and not that, I would say not that many supplements that actually make it to market end up sinking all the way to tier 5, but tier 5 means that there is sufficient evidence to conclude that this supplement either harms health or harms performance in a given application. So ideally, you would not want to see any supplements falling under that, falling their way all the way down to tier 5, but it does happen from time to time. Oftentimes when it's a supplement that harms health, that is kind of the precursor to some kind of regulatory action where it is, banned or removed from the market, or at least people try to remove it from the market with varying levels of success historically. And then, every now and then we will find a supplement that is supposed to help performance, but paradoxically actually harms performance. And so that would be a tier 5. And tier 5 is the kind of supplement that, kind of bring it all back full circle. When someone asks me, hey, is this supplement worth it? I say, well, stop right there. You know, what application are you talking about? And what magnitude of effect is worthwhile for you? Like, what do you consider worth it, right? And so then they give me that information, and we kind of go through these tiers. And a tier 1 supplement is usually a no-brainer as long as it's not cost prohibitive, like financially cost prohibitive. Tier 2 and tier 3, both of those kind of fall in that situation where I say, hey, this might give you a little extra. We're not quite sure. You know, how much are you going to miss the $40 a month that you're spending on this? Are you doing regular drug testing? Are you worried about that, you know, potential issues if you get a tainted supplement? That's where you start really getting into more specifics. Tier 4, it's pretty easy to say, I encourage you not to take it because this thing doesn't work for what you're trying to do. And then tier 5 is where you say, I'm actually pleading with you not to take it because this is going to make you perform worse, or this is actually going to harm you. And so the really tricky one is when you get to tier 5. There will be those instances sometimes where something can help your performance, but also harm your health. And so I would say it's an either or thing. If it hurts your health but helps your performance, I would still put that in tier 5 if there are serious health consequences. And so sometimes tier 5 is where you can easily say, I very strongly discourage you from taking it, but every now and then people will still push forward and take it nonetheless.
No, that's a great summary of the tier list. And there'll be one major question that comes out of that, which I'll address, is what the heck, what about caffeine? Where does that sit? And then the second is where we're going to dovetail from this and how potentially any supplement could land you in tier 5, which is the main thrust of this discussion. So really quickly, there was a really good meta regression that recently came out looking at caffeine, which I think is one of the reasons why it is not a tier 1 supplement, because it clarified something that we knew. We know caffeine has a relatively long half-life. We know caffeine can impact sleep, even for people who are habituated to it and feel like they can fall asleep after taking caffeine. There's sleep architectural impacts where it reduces REM and deep sleep, and you're spending more time in less high-quality stages of sleep, unfortunately. And then you're pitting the potential benefit of caffeine against the potential downside of reduced sleep. And one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that there actually are almost no longitudinal studies on caffeine looking at performance. And one of the reasons why, say, a citrulline malate might be stuck in tier 2, even if we do see more consistent effects, or a nitrate if once a meta-analysis comes out, is they're all looking at short-term outcomes. And we're kind of extrapolating to, is this improvement in endurance or strength actually lead to improved hypertrophy or longitudinal changes in, say, 1RM strength, to where now I can recommend to our strength and physique, community that might be something worth taking. So caffeine, for 2 reasons, in my opinion, is kind of the tippity top of tier 2, but probably not going to make it into tier 1, is the lack of longitudinal data. And based upon this meta regression, unfortunately, for most people, taking the kind of dose that consistently improves resistance training performance, you really can't do that after 9 or 10 a.m. If you have a normal sleep-wake schedule and cycle, without it having some negative impact on sleep. And the thing is you might be able to make an argument for, say, endurance performance for shifting caffeine up, because 2-3 milligrams per kilogram has been shown to more consistently improve performance. But when you look at the strength research, there are some studies where you can get a 3 milligram per kilogram intake of caffeine that is improving performance. But most of the time it's in that 4 to 6 range, and you see even more consistent results in kind of the higher end of that. So yeah, if we're talking, you got a powerlifting meet and it's okay if you don't sleep afterwards because you're probably not going to anyway because you're all hyped up, yeah, go ahead. But for regular training, especially if you get off work at 5 and you get to the gym at 5:30 and you're taking 200-300 milligrams in a pre-workout at 4:30 p.m., if I had to guess, I wouldn't, but I would not be sure if this is actually a net positive for you. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So that's to answer that caffeine question. I don't know if you want to chime in on that before I dive into the rest of this conversation.
Yeah. So I think the ultimate safety net for this tier system that makes it robust to people saying, Eric, you're an idiot for using this, is, like I said, it's totally application specific. Which is a total cop out, right? Because I can make you really refine your question into a way that makes it at least somewhat easier to address, right? And so I think that comes up. I think it's very relevant for caffeine because, like you said, you put it at kind of the tippy top of tier 2, and I used to feel that way, and now I'm not even sure if it's necessarily at the tippy top in aggregate. I think it is for certain applications, right? So
Sure.
if you told me that what you needed was to be slightly stronger 60 minutes from now, like today, then I'd say, yeah, that's tippy top of tier 2. We have plenty of evidence saying that as long as the dose is high enough, in 60 minutes, you probably will have better, performance on an endurance task, or, an explosive task, or even like a strength endurance or 1 rep max task, right? So across many types of exercise performance, if all we care about is what happens 60 minutes from now, today, one time, then absolutely, it's at that tippy top. And that's where most of the caffeine literature exists, is in that exact scenario. But if you were to ask me, will taking caffeine 60 minutes before my workouts daily for the next 12 weeks benefit my training adaptations, like you were alluding to, that's where things get a lot trickier, not just because of a very really kind of surprising lack of evidence. You would think that we had plenty to go with there, and we just don't. But you start getting into some really interesting questions, which is like, just to throw a few of them out there, it seems based on, a building pile of literature that you are probably, and when I say probably, I mean just based on the population percentages of how different people with different genotypes respond, you are probably, by the numbers, sacrificing some sleep or some sleep quality if you're taking a large dose of caffeine, like you said, after basically the mid-morning time frame. And for most people, not all, but for many, using caffeine as a daily training tool is going to involve, pushing that into the late morning, early afternoon, or even later. So then you have to balance the potential pros in terms of performance, acute performance, against the potential cons of chronic, reduction in sleep quantity or quality. Then you also have to layer on top of that the fact that we know surprisingly little, like really shockingly little, about the time course of caffeine habituation and caffeine withdrawal when it comes to specifically performance outcomes. We really don't even know that much about the basic stuff, like I have a headache, how long is that going to last, But when it comes to performance, we really just don't know what that timeline looks like. And so the question is, by the time you get into your 3rd week of this daily supplementation, have you basically habituated to the point where each daily dose of caffeine is just rescuing you from withdrawal symptoms and restoring a decrement in performance that would have otherwise been observed? So it gets really, the question gets really loaded. There's a lot to kind of dig into and unpack when you start to say, we're shifting out of the next 90 minutes in terms of our assessment and getting into the next 90 days. So all of that is to say, caffeine, it's really, really complicated, and I'm starting to get a little bit more bearish about, how we view caffeine as kind of a daily, regular pre-workout supplement in isolation. Now, we've got pretty good data for multi-ingredient formulations that include caffeine, but they also include things like creatine most of the time. And yeah, if you take creatine plus all the other stuff for 12 weeks, it's probably going to be pretty nice. But yeah, when it comes to like just caffeine alone, and we're focused on resistance training outcomes, I can only think of really like one study off the top of my head that has looked at that in a meaningful way. It was only 4 weeks long, if memory serves, 4 or 8, I believe 4. And caffeine was not significantly really doing much in terms of the, when you look at it in terms of statistical significance. So yeah, caffeine actually surprisingly has a lot to prove when it comes to like real world utility. And This is my call to action that I put out every few months. If you're thinking about doing a master's degree in exercise science or something related to sports nutrition, drop me an email, because there's about 4 very feasible, very practical studies that could be done to help us better understand the utility of caffeine and its that kind of habituation and withdrawal timeline. These are things that could very feasibly be done as a master's thesis, as long as you're at a university that has a medical school or a hospital associated and is willing to let you do supplement trials involving caffeine. So someone go do this work, please, preferably someone who's not me.
Well said. Thanks for adding in a little more detail to that discussion. So I think what we've done now is we've kind of fleshed out the possibility of a probable benefit to you taking a supplement. The reality is, when you really look at this objectively, though, supplements come onto the market with some degree of hypothetical basis, whether it's looking back at what was traditional medicine in certain countries or traditional libido or performance boosters. There is some rationale from something like that, all the way to having what we would describe as mechanistic research behind it, or a theoretical benefit, looking at an animal model, or in vitro, the way it impacts a cell, or just the way we know that the compound should function physiologically. And then that is used as, marketing copy. So most people, when they see a supplement hit the market, if they're just, consuming the marketing material, they're going to think it's tier 1 or tier 2. And in reality, it is typically tier 3 if we actually want to use high quality evidence to grade it. Is there human evidence showing this an actual specific performance or body composition benefit we're looking for? And the reality is that truly more than 99% of supplements end up in the mass grave of tier 4, showing that they do not have sufficient evidence. And in fact, we have evidence they don't do anything. That is just the reality. And in the 31 years, I believe, that creatine has been on the market, it is the only supplement for the purposes of strength and hypertrophy that has stayed in the tier 1 spot. Others have been elevated there temporarily, arguably, maybe, and then have fallen all the way down to tier 4, like HMB, for example. Others have maybe been there, but then due to health issues, they've kind of got categorized as tier 5, say like ephedra, for example. So you can make arguments, but ultimately, I think when you look at this probabilistically, 30 years, 1 supplement in tier 1 and 3 or 4, depending upon your goal and your perspective, landing in that tier 2 spot. And if you're a bodybuilder, a powerlifter, or a weightlifter, one of those beta-alanine, probably not there for you. CrossFit, strongman, medleys, stuff like that. A concurrent athlete, absolutely. Maybe that's even tier 1, like you said, Trex. But the point is that we're looking at a very, very small probability of any new supplement getting up to that top spot. And even if it was, I think it's reasonable to say, what kind of effect size can we expect? Maybe something as good as creatine, which, while good and consistent, we're looking at small to trivial effects for most of the things we're talking about. If you look at the acute strength data, there are some kind of random moderate effect sizes, but depending upon if you're looking at upper body, lower body, machine, free weight, most of the effects cluster around small. If you're looking at lean body mass, the effect is around small. And if you look at the one meta-analysis that came out recently looking at direct measures of hypertrophy, it's actually trivial to small. And that was a really cool meta-analysis done by Burke, where they only looked at ultrasound, computed tomography, or MRI changes in local muscle hypertrophy with the effect of creatine. And the effects were smaller. And that's probably because of the hydration effects of creatine, which are good and are part of the mechanism. But ultimately, most people who take creatine, they don't notice a visual change. They do notice some slight performance changes, and that is mixed in with placebo, of course. But it's the best case scenario, which is highly unlikely, of this tier 3 supplement becoming tier 1. It's going to provide trivial to small effects in the grand scheme of things. So if that's what we're weighing up on the probable upside, we need to think about the probable downside. And kind of the whole pitch of this podcast is that it's not just the financial cost. One thing you mentioned, Trexler, and this is a great segue, is that the tier 5 supplements, once they are found to be potentially harmful to health or performance, that is when the process might start and might be successful of removing them from the market. And that's because in most countries, the US being the most notable one, the supplement industry is regulated after the fact, meaning that there is a very low barrier to entry because supplements are typically described as isolated food products, things that are in the food supply, or they'd be classed as pharmaceutical drugs. So you can say, yeah, I've got this thing. It's definitely from nature. Please believe me. And I definitely made it in a high-grade lab. I didn't just put flour and get a pill capping mechanism at Walmart and then, spend a little more money on marketing and call it Mega Grow 2000 and have you taking flour pills. Absolutely didn't do that. And in fact, you can literally do that. And until someone decides to test your product or reports an adverse event and then, does something and communicates with the FDA, the likelihood of you getting taken off the market is extremely low. And you can rely on things like the placebo effect and marketing campaigns and ad copy to try to make money off that. And that is a valid strategy for being successful in the supplement industry, unfortunately, as we can see historically. Another very unfortunate valid strategy that is somewhat allowable, at least temporarily, by the fact that regulation occurs after the fact and that the amount of supplements that are out there far outpaces the scope and breadth of capability of any regulatory agency, is to put things in the supplement that aren't supposed to be there. Now, in some cases, this means you get a better effect out of those supplements, but it may not be the effect you want, and it may have disastrous consequences depending upon who you are. So people have talked in relatively ambiguous terms as to the scope of the issue of tainted supplements. Most of the time when you see this online, it's in the form of a tested athlete or a claiming natural lifter or natural athlete or natural bodybuilder who fails a drug test, and they get on social media and they go, it was definitely my supplement. And 99% of the comments are, sure, your multivitamin had D-ball in it, you liar. And they get wrecked on social media. And I'm not claiming that those aren't, in most cases, damage control or, just PR attempts. But I think
it's the most convenient place to go if you did it, right? Like it's easy because then you can say, of course it's in my system, but don't blame me.
Yes. And so we understand that. And, if I had to bet on any one of those given social media posts, I probably would if I had to bet. But you probably don't want to bet. You probably want to make an informed decision based upon when more evidence becomes available. So I think something that would surprise a lot of people is that this has actually been researched, not in the context of posting on social media, but in the context of what defense does an athlete who has an adverse finding when they're WADA tested, do they take when they go to a doping tribunal, right? And I will admit that is a very different thing. When you are actually making a post on social media, the barrier is, how impulsive are you and is your phone in your hand? The barrier for actually making a case that you had an adverse finding due to a tainted supplement in front of a doping tribunal when you're a tested athlete is much higher. You have to pay for your own legal representation. You have to pay for your own testing of the supplement. And you had to have the foresight to actually save the supplement. And you have to think reasonably and, either take or don't take the advice of your lawyer as to whether this defense is likely going to get you there. And having firsthand knowledge and experience with some people who've been in this very unfortunate situation, it's certainly an uphill battle. I knew an athlete who did have an adverse finding due to a tainted food product, not a supplement, and they did not think to save it, but they had what I would say is reasonable proof that in a criminal court would provide some doubt as to when they were last tested, when they traveled, where they traveled, what they ate, and peer-reviewed studies showing that in that country, that specific meat product was, commonly tainted with the specific thing that they failed for. And the response of the local officials was, yeah, sure, we'll give you a shorter ban if you tell on the person who sold it to you. Sold the drug you actually took because we don't believe you. So it was an uphill battle for them and they ultimately lost. But in a study that was actually covering 18 years of doping controlled data, back published in 2020, I believe, if I recall correctly, by Lauritsen and colleagues, 2022, but it covered from 2020 to 18 years prior. Dietary supplements as a major cause of anti-doping rule violations. They found that it was actually a very large percentage of athletes who were claiming this as their initial defense. And I think that in and of itself tells you something. So 26% of athletes with an adverse finding claimed the source of the banned substance was due to supplement use. Now, some of them might just be using that as a convenience defense, same kind of reason they'd get on Instagram. But I think the likelihood of that being the actual case and them making that as the defense they choose in court is much higher. And more importantly, of those 26% of athletes who said, hey, this was because of a tainted supplement, half of them were able to provide evidence in support of that claim. And I think that's probably the low end, given that personal experience I had of them that actually did have a tainted supplement. So this is a major issue in tested sport. I think that's the first thing we can see here. And so next time you see someone post on social media, yeah, you're probably right that they're just doing some CYA, but there's a decent chance that they might actually have a tainted supplement. And you might be thinking, well, okay, if it's this big of an issue, well, why is that? Probably because of the regulatory issues we talked about, but there are also other things going on. So drug testing has gotten more and more precise over time, so that a very small amount of contamination can result in an adverse finding far below the amount that would actually give you any benefit. So you're really not even getting the benefit of inadvertently doping at this point. So I think that's something to be aware of. And if we want to look at what's a decent predictor of the future, history is always a good one to look at, especially when there haven't been fundamental changes to a given industry. So, I talked about this on the 3DMJ podcast about a month ago with Steve Taylor, RRD. And one of the comments that we had in the YouTube kind of belayed the fact that people don't really want this to be true. I don't want this to be true. And they're looking for a way of like, listen, this is not a huge threat to me. It's not going to be me. And they said, hey, you were talking about these really high rates of contamination, but that was only an issue in the mid-2000s at the height of the pro-hormone craze. And I think it'll be fun to talk about just how crazy it was at that time point. But we really need to acknowledge there haven't been fundamental changes to the supplement industry, and there are parallels that have existed since. So what am I alluding to? Well, there was actually a time period where you could buy legal steroids, basically, over the counter at GNC, ordering them at bodybuilding.com. It was in the height of the quote-unquote pro-hormone era. And I would say probably more accurately, the pro-hormone, pro-steroid era is what they were called, because a pro-hormone is technically something that only becomes a anabolic hormone once it's converted in your body endogenously, like andro, for example. But there were other things that were just chemically altering. The supplement company chemically altered the name so it didn't look like the typical naming convention for an anabolic steroid, and just sold it straight up. And this was so prevalent that it resulted in a Anabolic Steroid Control Act change. In 2004, they modified the existing laws to redefine anabolic steroid to mean any drug or hormonal substance chemically or pharmacologically related to testosterone, and that was largely in an effort to stop the inclusion of designer steroids, pro-steroids, and pro-hormones from becoming just ubiquitous and sold over the counter, because they're being purchased by people underage, taken in larger doses than recommended, and having true negative health effects on people. And also drug testing failures, because it wasn't necessarily transparent as to what people were buying. So at this time period, there was a really good study published by Geyer and colleagues, and they analyzed 634, importantly, non-hormonal supplements, so creatines, proteins, caffeines, pre-workouts, etc., from 215 companies, and importantly, not just US, but across 15 countries. And as a whole, nearly 15% of the products contained unlabeled anabolic steroids, which is bonkers to me. That means you have a 1 to 2 out of 10 chance of any supplement you buy, even when it specifically is meant to be non-hormonal, actually having anabolic steroids in it if you purchase a supplement in 2004. Now, when they looked at supplements purchased from companies that also sold hormonal products, so they didn't just have like a line that contained your optimum nutrition standard kind of wholesome 50s bodybuilder line of protein and creatine, then it was higher. If the company did sell hormonal products, then we're looking at like a 21.1% chance. And if we shift to only companies that have a hormone-free line, it drops, but not nearly as much as you'd want it to, down to 9.6%. So still a 1 in 10 chance. If you're buying a non-hormonal product from a company that does not sell hormones, you could still have a 1 in 10 chance of inadvertently taking it. Now, this might have been kind of this rush to get all their products sold out. I know a lot of people did rush to buy pro-hormones in the mid-2000s, knowing that they'd come off the market, and the companies might have decided, hey, we have all these steroids, what do we do with them? Because then by 2007, the percentage had fallen drastically down to under 1% out of another repeat study of 597 products. And then I think this is what prompted that YouTube comment, Trex. It was like, oh, yeah, that was a brief issue before we got serious and changed the industry with this law. But this is really just one law. It wasn't a change to the regulatory approach that is used in the supplement industry. And there have been parallels since. And they're unfortunate because they really tell you that this has not changed. I think we can all remember back to the Jack 3D era and the time period, where, I mean, if you talk to someone who started lifting about 10 years ago and they got into pre-workouts, they will tell you while, itching their skin and massaging their gums with their tongue in this almost kind of feverish way, like, man, nothing hit the same as the pre-workouts from 2010 to 15. I don't know what it is. And I never say it out loud, but I think you were taking meth. That's why it doesn't hit the same. It's a good thing that this has changed. You don't want them to hit the same. Because quite literally, some of these supplements had DMAA or other amphetamine analogs. And that, while it peaked 10 years ago, again, that's showing that this is a recurring problem. And it was to similar levels. So, for example, Yoon and colleagues, they did an assessment in 2017 of supplements advertised for weight loss, fat burning, energy, or performance enhancement, which includes the category of pre-workouts, purchased online from 2015 to 2016. And guess what? 9.1% of them had illegal stimulants in them. So that's even after the era we're kind of thinking about still going on. If that study had been done 4 years earlier, I would guess it was a little higher. And, and we're seeing a similar parallel with SARMs now, selective androgen receptor modulators, right? And like, for example, USADA recently reported that there were 100 positive WADA findings for the SARM ostarine between 2015 and 2017. And I doubt that the majority of those were intentional doping by the athletes, but probably them taking muscle-building supplements that were not, third-party tested. So this is a recurring issue. And to give you an idea, just like at what point in the supply chain this is happening, it doesn't even necessarily have to be a quote-unquote shady supplement company doing this intentionally. The reality is that there are manufacturers that are supplying dozens of supplement companies sometimes, and they could be located offshore or in the country they're serving. And because the FDA is a post hoc regulatory agency, what is actually required, what is considered good manufacturing practices, is not enforced. It would be a good idea as a forward-thinking company to make sure you're actually following these things. But when it's not enforced at all, corners get cut, because what's the downside in terms of the actual financial, issue? And the scope of how often manufacturers in the supplement industry are not meeting the technically legal, but not, again, proactively regulated or enforced manufacturing best practices is staggeringly high. So in 2013, I'll just quickly say this, there was a report done where they looked at a bunch of different manufacturing places. And this is published by Matthews and colleagues, Prohibited Contaminants in Dietary Supplements. They reviewed this. 70% of manufacturers did not meet the requirements set forth by the FDA for good manufacturing practices. And that is pretty scary to me. That's not 10% of supplements. That's the majority of places that supplements are manufactured are not doing the things that would prevent contamination from occurring, even inadvertently.
Yeah, I was just going to say one little racket going on. That's too harsh a term, but one thing that consumers should be aware of is that some supplement companies will put a little logo on their containers and say, we follow good manufacturing procedures, as if it looks like it's some kind of like formal certificate or like verification, like badge almost. And in the vast majority of cases, it's completely meaningless. And it's just them putting a logo on their label and saying, our official company policy is that we're compliant with federal law and regulations, which is like any business putting on their website. We are certified that we don't launder money. We are giving ourselves credit for that. And also we pay taxes. So all of that is to say, don't get lulled into a sense of security when you say, hey, that looks like some kind of formal certificate indicating, some verification of quality. You got to actually look into what the logo is and what it says. And if all it says is like, we have decided we have good manufacturing practices, then it's essentially a meaningless, unregulated label that they're putting on their product.
Yeah, it's akin to saying this product is natural versus saying it's organic, which you will see in conjunction with the FDA symbol, because to claim a product is organic, you have to meet certain legal thresholds.
And it's not easy.
No, it is not.
A tough process.
And in the supplement industry, and we'll talk about this, if you want to prove that you actually follow GMP, you'll typically see an NSF certified GMP or a USP, so these third-party companies have these auditing programs. So US Pharmacopoeia, USP, is one of the more well-known organizations that will come in and audit your manufacturing plant, and they'll give you USP GMP certified. But if you're just seeing GMP by itself, you're basically saying, hey, we follow the laws, trust us. Can we verify that? Well, you don't trust us? Come on,
Yeah.
So,
and it is worth just clarifying that those logos that you just mentioned from specific companies that have auditing programs, those do mean something, but they mean a specific thing, which is that if that's the only logo you're seeing on there, we paid them to come audit our manufacturing practices, not to chemically test the exact product you're buying, right? That is like a factory level, auditing process of just like, hey, it looks like you got all your paperwork, the fire exit is labeled, you're doing all the stuff you're supposed to do. But again, that's not reflective of actually testing that product for purity or for potential adulteration and contamination.
Correct. Knowing that your product was manufactured in a plant that is doing things right will reduce the chance of inadvertent contamination, but you haven't actually verified the product. And there are, which we'll get into. We'll get into third-party testing and how do you go safely. But I think it's just really important to understand the scope of the issue. That, it was really bad in 2004, but it's probably really bad periodically, depending upon what is currently out there. And the reality is that because these manufacturers, which are not even necessarily directly connected to the supplement company, they are, a B2B business. Like, hey, I want to sell the supplement. Will you manufacture this? I'm going to outsource to China. We're going to save costs, and you're going to make me my insert name of supplement. The supplement company could be acting in good faith and just trying to save money and may not have the funds to, get that type of verification. And they might not know that they're selling you a supplement that could be contaminated. And that can occur when the transportation is happening and the containers themselves haven't been properly cleaned. Or it can be that the actual mixers or the material used to actually make the products have not been cleaned. And if, a hormonal product or drug, because sometimes these are also, making actual drugs illicitly or maybe legally, if they haven't been properly cleaned, you can get that contamination, and probably not at a level that'll even benefit you, because I have met the hilarious, the friend is like, hey man, I want to go to the expo and buy all the sample packets because I'm just hoping I get an inadvertently dose of steroids. I'm going to make some sick gains for the next 3 months. That's a bad idea, by the way. Like, you don't even know what hormones you're maybe putting in your body, but hey, placebo power to you. But anyway, this problem has not gone away. There has been no substantial changes to the regulatory issues. And to really kind of get an idea of the scope is challenging, the scope of this issue. How bad is it? But I think there was a very good review that was done by Yagam and colleagues. The good Grant Tinsley was a part of this. A lot of good authors on this, and they cited a ton of evidence. And I think this is an open access review if you want to read it. And it's titled Prevalence of Adulteration in Dietary Supplements and Recommendations for Safe Supplement Practices in Sport. This is a narrative review. And I don't think that in this case means that it's really a lower quality of evidence. It's just very difficult for us to have a true quantitative representation of this in a changing real world market. But they estimate somewhere between 10 to 30% of all supplements are adulterated, contaminated. They will have something in them. So that's not listed on the label. And, this is only one issue. Some of a more benign but still problematic issue, and it's actually quite common as well, that I don't think I'm going to talk about in this episode because it's not quite as scary or as much of a quote-unquote problem to your health or performance, is that this is when stuff that's not on the label is in there. A big issue is that some of the stuff that's supposed to be on the label, or at least at certain doses, or at least at certain potencies, is often not as well, So we're looking into changing the way we assess the potential harm of a supplement or benefit as viewing, on paper, it shouldn't have any harm and it might have a potential for benefit. But that's assuming the ingredients are actually what they say and not anything else. But the reality is there's a decent chance, and I'm not talking 1%, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, 6%, 7%, 8%, or even 9% Trexler. We're talking double digits, 10% to 30% chance that something that's not on the label that could have you failing a drug test and truly ruining your reputation and potentially competitive livelihood could be in the supplement, on top of whatever chance there is that what you would like to be there is underdosed or replaced with something else. Now, I know I'm a competitive natural bodybuilder. I'm a competitive powerlifter. I've been drug tested across, 3 different sports over, 16 years of competing. And I get that that's not everybody. And you may be like, listen, I don't care if I have a very small amount of something that's not going to impact me because I'm not getting drug tested. But I think we need to understand that supplement companies are sometimes purposely putting pharmaceutical drugs in their products to have an effect to get a market advantage as well. And there are it's hard to know how often that happens or whether this is inadvertent or purposeful, but there was a really interesting report that came out of supplements that had been identified by the FDA as having adulteration in them and seeing what was in them. And I think this is really telling if your goal is to just take supplements for health or performance generally, because you want to know, well, what's potentially in there, right? So there was a study that was done where they specifically looked at these reports from the FDA. And this is by Tucker and colleagues. Unapproved pharmaceutical ingredients included in dietary supplements associated with U.S. Food and Drug Administration warnings, okay? And what they looked at was, okay, what are they actually reporting? And they found a relatively broad range of contaminants. I think importantly, they're primarily occurring in muscle-building drugs that are linked to, giving you enhancement of libido or sexual health, or category, like basically energy, pre-workout, fat loss, muscle building, or libido and sexual health. Those are the ones that have the highest rates of contamination. And unsurprisingly, they have drugs that might lead you to believe these effects are, actually happening from the supplement. So for example, laxatives are really common in some of these weight loss drugs because it'll produce weight loss. I mean, it'll also produce some things you don't want. Also, in some of the pre-workouts and energy and mental health and clarity and nootropics, actual SSRIs, antidepressants are in there. And I can't tell you how bad of an idea it is to take an unknown type and quantity of SSRIs on top of whatever else you might be taking. You ever watch one of the commercials where they advertise an SSRI and, there's a 1-minute pitch and then a 1-minute list of disclaimers of potential side effects and drug interactions? You don't want to have that just happening without even consulting your doctor. Also, you'll find erectile dysfunction drugs are very common. So, when people are like, I don't know, Eric, I actually got something out of the Tribulus terrestris I took, or I don't know, Eric, I actually got something out of that long jack or that whatever, insert, herb that's supposedly based upon traditional Chinese medicine is going to benefit your libido. And you know what? I don't know enough about those herbs. They might. But it's quite possible that in addition to those herbs, you were actually taking a pharmaceutical drug to increase your frequency and strength of erections. And, those are having an impact on endothelial function, blood pressure, And you don't want to be taking those inadvertently and not knowing the impact and, again, the drug interactions you could be having. So even for people who are just out there for general health, do you want to be taking, unbeknownst to you, laxatives, antidepressants, and potential erectile dysfunction drugs? I would argue probably not. And that is a pretty big concern, because in those cases, they're being dosed in appropriate amounts to have an effect, because the supplement company is actually trying to get you to buy their supplement again because it quote unquote works. So this is a pretty big deal. And it's something that I think is probably just, it hasn't been talked about in these kind of numbers, just as kind of the shadowy thing. But when you really dig into the numbers, to go back to the intro to this whole podcast, they shocked me, Eric. And that's why they've like changed my perspective and my recommendations on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I mean, something that you alluded to that I just want to reiterate is like, you might look at that list of things and say, you know what, I don't care if maybe this is laced with an anabolic, or it's laced with a banned stimulant, or it's laced with, you know, a pharmaceutical. Even if I'm taking that without prescription, I don't really mind. But one thing that people don't consider is if you are also taking pharmaceutical drugs that you need, it's not at all unusual to notice drug-drug interactions or supplement drug interactions. So even if you're cool with the idea, maybe there is some actual Viagra in this, you know, herbal supplement, what do I care? Well, the reason you have a doctor prescribe your medications is to make sure that they are all compatible with one another, and that one is not going to cause issues with metabolizing the other. One is not going to make it more potent or less potent, or one isn't going to have an actual dangerous, you know, interaction that causes an acute medical emergency. So it's kind of a big deal to have unlabeled pharmaceuticals or unlabeled, you know, banned ingredients that are in these products, because you don't know how they might be interacting with, you know, medications that you might be taking. So it's a huge deal. And I mean, just to add to the list, I remember back in the day when they were doing the whole, you know, back when pro hormones were big, unsurprisingly, people were always taking supplements for what they call post-cycle therapy, right? So taking all the stuff after you did a cycle of pro hormones to then kind of restore your hormones back to their normal level. And people would take all sorts of like estrogen blockers and things like that. And around that time, they were finding breast cancer drugs. They were finding like tamoxifen inside these supplements because, hey, it's a pharmaceutical drug that's really good at blocking that estrogen receptor, specifically for estrogen-sensitive tumors. So yeah, it's just absolutely crazy to see the stuff that has snuck its way into the supplement market, and as you've highlighted many times, things that continue to find their way into this market. And it's funny that I was just reflecting as you were talking about, you know, you mentioned that there haven't been a lot of major changes to the way that the industry is regulated. And it is funny because when I thought back to the instances that I can think of for when action, you know, some kind of regulatory action took place in a manner that actually changed policy or changed laws, you know, new stuff on the books, there seems to be a common thread. And this isn't going to be a thread that resonates with anyone who's not American, I don't think. But if you were to think, what would be important to me if I was just like the perfectly average, stereotypical 65-year-old congressman in America? Like, what would really get me going and get me excited about putting pen to paper and writing legislation? The two things that I can think of that really got the ball rolling were things that impacted baseball and things that impacted the U.S. military. So like, for example, I remember, I'm pretty sure ephedra, one of the things that really moved the needle was the death of a baseball player who actually had a heart attack. When you think about the pro-hormone, the first kind of batch of legislation there, that was pretty much all related to the home run stuff that was getting out of control. And Congress spent a lot of time on the books talking about pro-hormones. And then the designer steroids that came after, again, it was the whole Balco thing in American baseball. And then you think about what finally urged and kind of moved the needle to get some action going with DMAA. I'm pretty sure it was actually 2 deaths in the military from people that were like training and had acute medical events that unfortunately took their lives. So I think the moral of the story is, in America, if you want anything to get going with legislation, it's got to either impact baseball or the military. Otherwise, it'll probably go untouched for another few decades.
Absolutely, well said. I mean, I'm sure if there's adulterants occurring in apple pie as well, that would be another quick action.
Or like the 4th of July hot dog eating contest.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So yeah, we're going to find out that those specific hot dogs are actually the least, harmful processed meats that are out there in the future. So, watch that space. For those who do want to read more about this, of course, Kai, as always, thank you for having a lot of stuff in the timestamps. But one thing that he'll now add at this timestamp is that this is an article that all the mass subscribers have access to. And we decided to make it the cover story and freely available for everybody because I just think it's really important. And it's something that I wouldn't want behind a paywall. I just wouldn't feel right about it, considering it was a surprise to me and I'm relatively well read. So this is a free article that you can also find on Stronger by Science. And it is, when should I consider taking a new supplement? And I think we've done a good job of showing how supplements are really not going to give you much of a probable benefit, even in the best case scenario. And being probably the most alarmist I've ever been in my career, to be honest, Eric. I'm normally the person being like, we're painting with too broad of a brush on processed foods. We're painting on too broad of a brush on the potential harms of high protein diets. Sugar's really not that bad, But this time I'm coming across as like, the prohibitionist, the scary prude who thinks the sky is falling. But I just feel like I'm right, Like I think the evidence is there, and it's enough that I think people should be a little concerned. But I don't think this is, kind of the stock standard. I think what they teach people in RD school, that they have to go, no supplements, food first, even if taking creatine is, like a good idea. And there's no reason why you can't just simply take creatine. And I don't know, but it's harming our children. It's a gateway drug. Like, I don't buy any of that. I'm not saying that. I'm not just anti-supplement, but I am highly pro-informed consumer. And unfortunately, I don't think much of the industry wants you to be informed about this stuff. And because there's such a strong influence, the supplement industry is, the Venn diagram of the supplement industry and the bodybuilding industry is closer than the Olympic rings. You know what I'm saying? Like, it kind of just looks like you squinted a little bit looking at a circle. They're very, very entwined. So you're not going to get good information on that, unfortunately, or at least not well-popularized information, and people will actively downplay. And even the consumers because they just don't want this to be true. I don't want this to be true. But fine, I'm not anti-supplement or even supplement industry, but I do think in this relatively harsh jungle, you want to have a mosquito net. You want to have the knowledge of maybe I shouldn't be hanging, bloody red meat outside of my tent where there is an active, set of carnivores lurking, right? So how do you arm yourself against the jungle? This very strange analogy that I've decided to stick with. Well, I think we have to go back to that whole concept of third-party testing. And there's a whole industry there for a reason. There's a reason that companies like NSF or USP or Consumer Labs exist. And, you do need to now actually figure out which ones are legit, which ones, like you brought up, Eric, are not just the company putting the equivalent of natural on their product. There's a bunch, and there's a good discussion of this in a open access review that was done by Matthews and colleagues, prohibited contaminants in supplements, or prohibited contaminants in dietary supplements by Matthews and colleagues in 2018. He's got a section and even a figure showing some of the third-party labels, and these do change over time. But some of the most common ones are NSF, are USP. There's the Informed Choice or Informed for Sport. There's Aegis Shield. There's Consumer Labs. There's several, and they are different in different countries. Another great source that you can always check out is your local WADA representative. They typically talk about what are some of the ways that you can get, certified safe for sport supplements. And you will see that larger companies with a larger bill or rather expense budget will put time and effort into this just to show you that the scope of the problem is pretty significant. It's worth the money for them not to have that reputation hit. So absolutely. And like Trexler talked about, just because you have a certification that the manufacturers are doing their job right is not the same as actually getting batch tested supplements. And depending upon your level of risk aversion, you may want both. I think if you're getting the latter, you probably don't need the former. Like the whole reason you want the manufacturing plant checked is to make sure that, what's in the label is what's supposed to be there. So if you are, getting third-party testing for the actual batch tested supplements, that's probably the most powerful thing you can do.
Yeah. I was going to say, if you're telling me that the supplement, you tested it by batch and it is not adulterated and it meets label claims, I don't really care about how your paperwork's organized in the factory, because that is part of the audit, is they kind of go through all those kind of regulatory things. No, I totally agree with you. And I think the only other caveat I add to that is when possible, I like to go with something that is batch tested. If I really had skin in the game and it really mattered to me, another good practice is to keep 1 or 2 servings of the supplements that you take in the original packaging with the batch and lot number. That way, again, this is if you have like real serious skin in the game. If you're worried that you're going to fail a drug test that costs you your job or gets you banned from a sport, if you have the lot number, the batch number, and some of that supplement, that at least puts you in a position where you can fight the fight. Even if it is, even if it's supposed to have been tested and all that other stuff, again, it's not a terrible idea to hold on to that stuff just in case. So that's the one caveat or one kind of addition I would add in. The second thing is I will acknowledge that there are some scenarios where I will use supplements that are not third-party tested, but it is really only in the scenario that I know, because Helms, you and I are in unique positions where we know folks in the fitness industry who do own supplement companies. And it's like, if I know a person and I know not just that they have integrity, but also that they have a work ethic where I know that they are doing all the little things right, because it's not just...
And then they have a direct hand in the manufacturing that is not outsourced.
Yeah. So again, it's not just the intentional, shady kind of stereotypical, I'm going to, do wrong by the consumer because I'm trying to get an advantage. Sometimes it is, like you said, completely out of the hands of, the people way down that production chain who are actually distributing the supplement. So the only scenario where I'll deviate from something that is kind of batch tested and approved for sport would be if it's just, I know that this person has a lot of integrity and has a lot of attention to detail and has a good kind of chain in that manufacturing process. Because I know for a lot of like really small companies, it can be just totally cost prohibitive to get, because you have to do this third party testing on a product by product basis. It's not just like a company pays a one-time fee. It's you have to pay for each one of your products that's actually getting certified. And so I don't want to create a situation where I'm unable to kind of support my buddies who I know are doing a good job. But yeah, outside of that one kind of unique exception, yeah, you really do. If you have real skin in the game, you probably want to take those 2 steps of, relying on a high quality third party certification and also, retaining a dose or 2 and kind of keeping it. It may be silly, but it's probably worthwhile.
I totally agree. And I created a flow chart that you can find in that article that you can find in the show notes. And basically, how do you decide when to take a supplement? And ultimately, it's based upon, unless it's a tier 1 or tier 2, you shouldn't be taking it, because it's the probability of benefit is very, very low, and the magnitude of benefit best case scenario is also very low. So there's no downside to being a late adopter to something that starts as tier 3 and then eventually becomes tier 1 and tier 2. And then I even describe and provide some like information on how to gauge if something is tier 1 or tier 2, because everything is going to seem like tier 1 or tier 2 when you engage with marketing material. And again, if there's an absence of evidence, then that's all you're going to have, in some obscure, textbook or Chinese text or in vitro study or, something like that. So the first step is it a tier 1 supplement or is it a tier 2 supplement? And then if the answer is yes, then there's another part of that flow chart that asks, are there longitudinal data of a direct, meaningful effect relevant to your goals? And I provide a definition of what is longitudinal data, what is direct data, what is a meaningful effect, and is it relevant? And an excellent tool to supplement this information is check out examine.com. They do great work, and they've got a basic database of the effects and the consistency of the research and essentially a wiki on all of the supplements that have human data. And you can get a decent read on just looking at that for any given supplement. And if they don't have information or if it's not clear, guess what? It ain't tier 1 or tier 2. And then the next question is, okay, well, can you obtain a third-party tested or licensed version of it? Now, licensing is another B2B business model. The most notable example is CreaPure and then Carnicin. And these are companies that typically name the same thing as the product. And what they do is they provide a high-quality, high-potency, high-purity specific product, and they license to supplement companies. And larger supplement companies that have the budget for it, they'll just outsource it because it takes care of all this for them. And those companies, if you were to go to the CreaPure or the Carnicin website, for example, you'll see that they are doing internal and third-party testing for both purity as well as adulteration. Now, the thing is if you just see Carnicin or CreaPure as part of a multi-ingredient pre-workout supplement, but the rest of the product looks relatively, normal, you don't see any other instances of the third-party testing, that's not saying that all of it was done in such a way that you can be confident. But if you're seeing a creatine product that is using CreaPure, I would be reasonably confident that that should be a much lower risk of contamination. I can't speak to how it was transported once the CreaPure got to that supplement company and they put it in their bottles and et cetera. So that's not a completely risk-free endeavor, but it's certainly another option. And I think it should be mentioned. And that's a, shout out to Ben Escrow who brought that up. I think it might even been on a Iron Culture episode, but that's another way of doing this. And then the final step is, all right, so if it is tier 1 or tier 2, you can obtain third-party tested or licensed versions of it, then yeah, I would say you go ahead and take it, but you need to still acknowledge that the risk can't be completely abolished. And I can't quantify the risk if you do all those things. I think it would be acceptable. It's something that I take, and I would take even as a drug-tested athlete who, man, can you imagine, Trex, what would happen to like Eric Helms if he failed the drug test and got accused of being a fake natty with that kind of evidence? It would
Eric Helms Incorporated. Yeah, that would not be ideal.
No, it would be a bad day in the life of me.
And one of the reasons I care so much is because it would affect me too, which would be very problematic.
Truly. No, I mean, but in all seriousness, like I am a very collaborative person. So my co-authors, my university, my students, the mass writers, the rest of 3DMJ, that's probably what is fueling some of the alarmism, is me just going through the scenario of, oh my God, what if I had a tainted supplement and I failed a drug test? It would be, I would have to, someone should call me. You know, and if that happens, you give me a call because I am not okay. All right, just know that.
Yeah.
So anyway, folks, I hate to be the less jovial, more serious, more kind of dire, bad news about the industry, but ultimately my only goal here is to provide you with tools so you can be an informed consumer. So that's the best thing we can do. We're all about informed consent, and we're also about informed consumers here at Iron Culture. So again, if you are skeptical of my degree of criticism of the supplement industry or my degree of alarmism, I would highly encourage you to take a look at many of these open access narrative reviews if you want the direct literature rather than my interpretation of it, or if you just want to dive deeper, but you are interested in my take, definitely check out the Stronger by Science free article, or if you're a mass subscriber, you've already read this and you're already well informed. So that's all I've got, Trex. I'm going to leave it to you. If anything else you want to add or close out on this topic.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, First of all, I think you did a great job with the article. I love the article. I think this episode is a great overview. Like you said, I'll put some words in your mouth. It's absolutely unbelievable to me that there are humans on this planet who don't subscribe to the Mass Research Review, because they would have already known this. And I'm pretty sure I've covered other studies specifically by Peter Cohen and colleagues in the past in Mass that have talked about similar issues of tainted supplements. If I haven't done it in Mass, I know I've done it elsewhere. But yeah, it's something that, our subscribers have been ahead of the game in terms of like using the supplement tier kind of heuristic as a bit of a filtration mechanism for making these types of decisions. But I think your article takes that little seed of an idea and really turns it into something that's much more practical and actionable. And I mean, in my lifetime, I have had a similar kind of awakening with regards to supplements, right? So like, I remember at one time when I was younger, failing a drug test for employment purposes. So I was trying to get hired. This is before I'd competed in anything worthwhile. And I failed the drug test because this was back before DMAA got banned. It was, everybody was, if you took a pre-workout, you were taking it. And it was totally above board, totally legal in the INBF, WNBF. I still remember the day when they said, it's actually banned, but we're giving like a 1-year grace period or something like that. But at that time, there were no athletic bodies of any kind had banned it. But if you took a cheap drug screen, like a really basic one, you would fail for methamphetamine. And so like that's, I think perhaps one additional thing is like, if I had just like not pushed back, then I would have just not gotten that job. So it's worthwhile, if you think that you've wrongfully been flagged for something, keep in mind that there are situations where better drug screens can actually distinguish more between things that have similar compounds, right? So that's one thing I wanted to kind of add, is that, that's if you fail a drug test and you're completely blindsided by it, it's a possibility worth considering, is that it's a false positive. But I think that false positive experience was the first time where I was like, maybe I haven't been thinking enough about the way I engage with supplement consumption. And then, obviously in grad school, my lab, we did a lot of supplement trials. We did a ton. And that started to really influence the way I viewed supplements, because you can look back at my publication record. We did a lot of supplement studies, and very few of them would you actually find a like meaningful positive effect. It's not none of them, but very few of them. Like I think that our lab was kind of one of those labs that had a reputation for publishing more null findings than your typical supplement lab, And so that kind of started to really influence. I got into doing research because I wanted to do a lot of these supplement trials, and eventually I kind of lost an appetite for it. And I do think that actually played a pretty big role in me kind of taking a detour in my career, because at the end of my PhD, I felt very well trained to continue doing supplement studies, and I just didn't want to, because I was just like, I no longer have that excitement of like, I wonder what incredible effect we're going to find here. Because like you said at the beginning of this episode, when you start looking at like, well, what's the best case scenario? It's creatine. How many creatines are there? One. If you're not discovering literally the next creatine, it's probably going to be like something that's maybe not worth writing home about. It's really sobering to kind of think, am I ready to do 35 more years of that? And the answer was no, which is why, now that I'm back in the academic world, it's a very different research trajectory that I'm working toward, So I've had some of these moments where I've made these realizations that have, like you have experienced, kind of dramatically shifted the way I look at those decisions as a potential consumer of any given supplement. And I think one of the biggest experiences, the really eye-opening one, I co-authored a textbook for the NSCA. So they've got a certification for what they call tactical strength and conditioning. So people who are like police, military, fire, things like that. So it's kind of like occupational strength and conditioning type of stuff. So I co-authored the chapter on dietary supplements, and these are folks who, if they fail a drug test, they lose their job in a lot of cases. I mean, and that's a career. I almost lost out on a crappy retail job, right? Working at a supplement store. Who cares, right? When you're like a teenager. But man, when you're, trying to earn a pension and you've been doing, 15 years of service for the police force or, doing your military work, like, yeah, it matters big time. Like, we think our life would be, ruined if we failed a test for a bodybuilding show, a powerlifting meet. And you and I, maybe it would be pretty terrible, but for the average competitor, it's a 1-year timeout or whatever the case may be. It's a timeout from your hobby, right? No competitions for you. Come back, when you're not banned, or just move to the next organization if we're being completely honest. But yeah, if you're ending your career and your livelihood, your ability to support your family, like that stuff matters. So in that chapter, we really dug deep into the legislative history, the prevalence of adulteration in supplements, and as the person who wrote a large portion of those specific aspects of that chapter, for me it was we wrote that I think back in 2015 or 2016, and yeah, it had a huge impact on the way that I view the potential downsides of consuming an adulterated supplement, and just how many times the supplement industry has showed us that it either is unwilling or simply incapable of providing a level of regulation that would be necessary to take those decisions out of the consumer's hands, to take that regulatory burden, I would say, out of the consumer's hands. It's the supplement industry from its inception in the United States has been really difficult to wrangle and to keep in line with regulations. And unfortunately, we need articles like yours. We need podcasts like this episode that kind of help consumers make those decisions and kind of, grab people by the shoulders, give them a shake and say, hey, it's not conspiracy theory. This idea that you could have a tainted supplement, they are out there. We can quantify it. Many researchers have, and the percentage is higher than you think. So this is not necessarily the most fun kind of episode to do, because we prefer to talk about fun, positive things that help you get gains. And this is all about scary, not fun things that help you get banned from sport or lose your career. But nonetheless, sometimes you got to do the important ones, even if they're not fun and cheerful. So credit to you for steering the ship. And I think you did a great job.
Well, I appreciate that feedback, and I think that's a great summary. Folks, I think we'll leave it there. It's always a pleasure and a privilege to have you listen, and hopefully next time you'll be graced by the Trinity. But today you're going to have to be okay with the duos, the double Erics, double the Erics, double the fun. And if you liked this episode, do us a favor and like it. Also, if you're feeling really generous, and man, we appreciate it, go ahead and leave us a rating and review. Not that I'm trying to influence you, but most people who I respect, who are worthy human beings, who make the right decision, leave 5-star ratings. You do with that information what you will. And also, make sure to give us a shout out on social media and come back every single insert date here, and we'll see you in the next episode.